Hello, I hope that you enjoyed that interlude with Michael Unger speaking about resilience and application um, to practice. So I wanted to come back to think again about social ecological approaches to resilience, again, just because that's kind of where a lot of researchers have landed at the University of Brighton and other places. So the contrast between a social ecological approach and a more strictly developmental psychopathological approach might be along things like attention to contradictions in people's accounts and in people's functioning, really, that people might be, for example, experiencing a lot of resilience in one area of their life, like academics, and not in other areas of life, like their home life. That there might be multiple levels of analysis, that you might be looking at individual level processes, but also up the chain through family, relationships, community, and structure. That also there might be cultural variations in what resilience means, looks like, and is enacted, right? So something that supports a child in China to be resilient might be very different from what supports a child in the UK to be resilient. And idiosyncratic meaning making, so allowing opportunities for children and communities to make their own sense of the adversity that is facing them, which I think in general is really important for just shifting the power out of clinicians' hands and more into the hands of people in communities who've been historically marginalized from those areas of power. The other thing that can happen is that in a socio-ecological approach, there is more of a process-oriented language of mechanisms instead of factors, and resilience over things like resiliency. And you still see a back and forth where people talk about resilient children or showing resilience, and that language, I don't know that there's necessarily a good way of always referring to process instead of outcome, but it's something to keep in mind. An example, one really great example, I think, of the social ecological approach in action is found in the work of Theron et al., where they took a kind of more ethnographic approach to the lives of 4 resilient youths, and they were specifically interested in cultural roots of resilience. So, for example, contrast this with the Werner study, which again was so revolutionary, but it didn't speak at all about how those children's culture in Hawaii, how that might have supported them and supported them to achieve more in their lives or have functioning and healthy relationships as adults and to be caring parents to their children. That didn't actually come out, did it? So Theron et al., what they did was they did a study with a couple of children from South African townships and a couple of Canadian Mexican immigrants, so children who were born in Mexico and immigrated to Canada, to Vancouver. And they were interested in these aspects of their culture, their non-Canadian culture, that supported them through resilience. And the whole article is really interesting to read and very accessible, very easy to read. But one thing that they that I wanted to flag was this idea of a shared, of a culture of sharing. So all 4 of these children came from cultures of sharing, and so the children in the townships would share their toys, they would share food, the families and households would share food and economic resources. There was also, for the Canadian Mexican children as well, there was sharing toys, but also sharing knowledge. So when one of the children lost their parents, they were taken in by another member of the family, so very clearly sharing there, but also the idea that you might share knowledge, wisdom, creativity, that sort of thing. And again, so this is something about interdependence and sharing and giving rather than individualism. Those children were resilient because their culture emphasized independence and sharing and exchange and reciprocity, not because the kids were expected to be strong on their own in the face of everything that they had, nor were they kind of charity cases where things were given to them, yet there was no transformative change of their situation, right? And one framework for thinking about this social ecological approach and kind of helping you to adapt it into life and practice comes from the resilience framework, which was developed by researchers at the University of Brighton, including Angie Hart, who's a professor here. And, you know, as I've said, we've spoken about the different structures, different layers of mechanism. On this, you have some examples of things that are very much individualistic, like core self. So having a sense of hope, being able to know yourself, being able to take responsibility for yourself, right? But there are also things that are very much about interdependence. So having somewhere to belong, having good influences, keeping relationships going, having responsibilities and obligations, making sense of where you've come from, having friends. There's also things that are about processes of coping, right? Being able to calm down and self-soothe, being able to lean on others when necessary, being able to have a laugh, being able to have boundaries. There's also things that show that this is not a trait, but this is a process of change in learning. So being able to have a sense of forward thinking around achievements, life skills, careers or life plans, having mentors. And then I think the really radical thing as well, compared to a strictly developmental psychopathological approach, is in including what Hart, Blinko and Cameron called the basics. Exercise and fresh air, access, transport, being safe, having money to live, good enough housing, getting enough sleep, right? Things that actually, if you don't meet those needs, it's really difficult to get any of the rest in play, right? As Michael Unger said, you have to ensure that the kids have breakfast if you want to expect them to learn. And so maybe what you have to do then is just give breakfast, right? Is just provide the breakfast. So this is one way in which resilience theory can translate into practice. A practitioner who's supporting an adult or a child might look at this kind of framework and say, okay, where do you already have things in place that we can lean on and support, or where do you have maybe are there some gaps that we can fill and try to develop what's missing there. And so this is working through different levels of protective mechanisms. And so in coming back to the collaboration that I did with ODI, this is a visualization of protective mechanisms that we came up with. So this is to support children. So there are things that are very much at the individual level, like perseverance. The child learns how to persevere, maintaining a future orientation, but also coming up, there's supportive teachers and peers, developing effective coping skills, particularly in the face of the many daily hassles and stressors that they might face, having parental monitoring or a safe and supportive home life that's stable, and having cultural values that support resilience, and financial resources in the community that define what opportunities there are for education, medical care, healthcare, leisure opportunities. So you can see that in this, resilience is very much about things that happen at very different levels. And these are all protective mechanisms that across many different studies and many different cultures and countries we keep coming back to, as these are things that are really important for promoting resilience amongst children. Other protective mechanisms that come up a lot in research are things like positive emotions. Social support is so important. I wrote a paper on that. Sometimes even repressive coping, kind of suppressing your emotions or self-distraction sometimes. But mostly about kind of problem-solving coping and effectively coping with emotions. Really importantly, prior low-level experience of adversity is protective, because what can happen is people go through something, they kind of get infrastructure and resources around that, they learn some things from it, they make meaning from it, and then when the next thing happens, they're a little bit more prepared, right? In educational context, I'm not going to go into huge detail about this, but there's, within the kind of last 15 years, there's a lot of, there's some initiatives and movements to apply resilience theories at a whole level of a school. Looking at children within their school context, thinking how can you engage parents that way, how can you change the culture of education at the school. And so Morrison and their colleagues have within their paper a structure for identifying protective factors for each individual child, for looking at how developmental processes unfold over time. So again, schools are really helpful in this way because you've got the kid for a certain number of years. And thinking about multiple contexts of protective mechanisms. So what can happen at the school level to encourage resilience? How can peers be supported to help each other? How can families be supported? And how can things work at just the individual child level? And I wanted to think as well, as we kind of close this out, about resilience during COVID. So again, as I've mentioned, resilience is about adversity, and I think this is a fairly, it's probably unique in history in the way that this is so much a collective experience, although different different countries have had very different experiences with this disease and with how it's unfolded at societal level. But we do have examples of other kind of mass issues where there's been prolonged conflict, there's been climate change related disasters, but certainly with COVID we do have a collective and individual grief that has multiple traumas over a sustained period of time. And there have also been significant resource stressors and I think disruptions to coping mechanisms. A lot of the things that you might have normally done to deal with stress or challenge or grief, they don't necessarily work for this context, or you have to do something different in order to access them, right? You can't necessarily just go out for a drink with a friend or go to a movie. So you can still get social support, you can still have self-distraction, but it's different. So some research is coming out now that reflects on what has helped people to show resilience during this time, what is supporting people in resilience. And also there have been some frameworks, particularly at the very beginning, thinking, well, what do we know about resilience in other contexts that can potentially help us to navigate this? So Walsh published a think piece for therapeutic practitioners, which based on resilience research and theory and practice from beforehand said that one thing that would be really important for therapists in supporting their clients would be looking at shared belief systems in meaning-making processes, so thinking about how we can interpret and make meaning of the things that we're facing, even when a lot of it is insensible, really, but how can we make meaning out of this? Having a positive, hopeful outlook and having a sense of active agency, and that's something that therapists can support their clients with, and also that one can hope to foster within social groups and families and communities, is having that hope, right? And again, in resilience research, hope really matters. It really, really matters, and if you can find it, it's really powerful. It doesn't change the external reality, but it changes how people can deal with the external reality. And having also transcendent values, we come back to strengths, right? Having some transcendence and spiritual moorings for inspiration. So these values and inspiration can be through nature, through art, or through spiritual practice, if that's something that people find helpful to them. So this is how Walsh encouraged therapists to support their clients in the face of this. And if what you'll notice there is that these resilience processes, they don't in and of themselves change the adversity, but they change how we can see that adversity and experience it without engaging in what I'd call maybe toxic positivity, about saying, well, everything's fine, or we're going to find a silver lining, or all that stuff. That it's a more well-rounded approach to saying, what can we do to understand how this is happening and the impact it's having, and try to find some kind of hope. And empirical research that has looked at things that have supported people to be have resilient processes over this time. One of the main things that has come out is the importance of social connectedness, which is ironic, isn't it? But that the social connectedness, this doesn't have to be about being in the presence of other people. It's about having larger and diverse social networks and being able to access those in certain ways to reduce fatigue and stress. So those were the outcome measures that they were looking at, were fatigue and stress. And I think, again, that's really important, and it looks different for everybody, but that's also something we can think about in terms of how we understand resilience and how we promote it. This again points us towards the idea that resilience is not an individual thing, it's not a personality trait, and it's not just down to you as the individual. And I know that you often hear from us that we hope that you're taking time for self-care, and that is meant kindly as a reminder to try to do that. But it's not only about that, right? It has to be about what else is around you, and what kind of social supports are there, what kind of community supports are there, what can be done at an institutional level to reduce fatigue and stress and promote social connectedness, right? It's not just about the single person, the individual. And there's a lot of dialogue right now at political levels and in psychological circles about the importance of collective and community resilience. So showing that as services have been disrupted, or people are facing vulnerability where they previously didn't, such as food scarcity or digital exclusion, that collective and community responses to those problems have actually been really, really important to supporting individuals. And things like community food sharing initiatives and mutual aid, increasing digital access, that these are really important for how communities and individuals are navigating COVID on an ongoing way. And some of these are new community initiatives that grew out in response to what happened, but some of these are also developing from existing programs and communities, and so there's interest in thinking, okay, what's worked effectively and how could that be supported? So some critical questions that you might ask on resilience during COVID is, well, first of all, what counts as resilience? And I wonder myself if we're almost too close to it to know right now. But seeing things like fatigue and stress as some outcome measures seem fairly sensible to me. I wonder if we can see resilience as an individual trait any longer, given this, if only because we can see very clearly how much context really does affect individual circumstances, and the availability of coping mechanisms and things like that. What roles have structural risks and protections played in individuals' resilience? There's starting to be research that comes out on this, so things like different health policies or masking policies. How of that, is there a relationship between that and resilience or well-being? That'll be really interesting to see. How has this collective adversity challenged our received knowledge about things like coping, recovery, resilience, perseverance, or character strengths, right? Having gone through this, what do we still stand by, and what do we change? And resilience is about change. There's no failing in changing. That is how it works, is changing and adapting. So being able to look back on our own understandings is very much within a resilience framework. And I wonder if it's possible to think that the adversity of COVID can be transformative. Is that a case of toxic positivity, or can it be a case of toxic positivity? Or are there ways in which, because the structures have been disrupted, because perhaps values have changed, is there space for that to be a positive transformation? And, without getting too cheesy, I think that you guys as students are really where that's going to come out and see, because you're going to then go out into the world having been through this at every level, and you're the ones who are going to be shaping our society for the decades to come. So if there is a space for that adversity to be transformative, if it's there, I think you're going to be the ones to see it and to make that happen. So in critical comparison, this is a lecture on resilience and strengths. If we put these two concepts side by side, what do we see? Strengths doesn't embed adversity within that. I think sometimes it's implicit that adversity is out in the world, but it's not part of the characterization. Whereas resilience explicitly acknowledges adversity. And I think sometimes the resistance between, the resistance against resilience or the resistance against strengths maybe comes down to a point of view about whether or not you think adversity needs to be part of the conversation around a positive and adaptive human functioning. Strengths have a construct that is fairly static, right? It might be a state or a trait that perhaps you can develop, but it's not a process. Whereas resilience is all about change and process. So again, it might be more suitable for different contexts or different studies or different applications. Strengths is really about what strengths are possessed by the individual. So again, that might be really helpful in certain contexts and not helpful in others. Whereas resilience is focused on protective mechanisms that are psychological, social, cultural, or even, and this is really recent, environmental, right? So, in conclusion, we have character strengths that are a counterpoint to diagnoses, risks, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses in describing psychological function. And even though I've pointed out a lot of limitations as I see them in the character strengths concept, I think that's so important and really positive that actually there is a language to talk about the ways in which we are amazing. I think that's fantastic. Resilience, by contrast, is a conceptualization of processes of thriving in the face of adversity, and it really addresses how to cultivate well-being when life is challenging. So strengths are maybe more about well-being when life is all right. Resilience is really focused on that challenge. Contemporary resilience theories complement an articulation of human strengths, I think, because they put those individual characteristics within multiple layers of protective factors. What a typo! Protective mechanisms that interact to facilitate change. So strength and resilience, I think, they offer different critical narratives around how you get to well-being. And I have this question for you. Which one are you more persuaded by? Which one speaks to you? Why? Have a think. And I'm going to put this video up on the my studies, a poem from Maya Angelou, which I think really speaks to both strengths and resilience in our times and times of before. And I highly recommend diving into her poetry and memoir. So thank you so much for joining me today. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of the week, and enjoy the rest of the activities to do with strengths and resilience on this module. Thank you so much for listening.